There are a lot of great things that you need to know about when it comes to project preferences. And I'm starting in a complete empty blank project purposely because I want to mimic what Premiere Pro would look like right after you install Premiere for the first time and you launch Premiere in order to get into the preferences. You're going to end up in a project like this, and this is probably one of the very few times that I'm ever going to be in a complete empty project per se. And that's because I wanted to mimic the fact that I believe you should set your preferences right after you install Premiere Pro CC. And the reason is once you set preferences, it will affect future projects. And at some point, you may want to come back in and make a change in your preferences. That's fine. That's not a problem. You can do that at any time. So let's jump right into preferences. So I'm going to navigate up to the word Premiere Pro here at the top menu. I'll mouse click on that, and then I'll select preferences. Now, on a PC, the way to get to preferences is if you navigate up to the word edit, and preferences is down near the bottom of that. So on a Mac, of course, Premiere Pro, preferences, general. That will, of course, open up the preferences window. Now, the folks over at Adobe are really smart because they dialed in everything in all of these categories real well. So I don't need to talk about every single little detail. I'm just going to point out the most important ones that you need to know about when you're a beginner/intermediate editor. So let's jump into it. Here in the general category, I'd like to talk about at startup. You may want to select Open Most Recent because that will allow you to open up the last project that you worked in while you're in Premiere. The other option is Show Welcome Screen. So I would suggest Open Most Recent. Now, default transition duration and default audio transition duration is selected or at least set on my computer to 15. I did this, I changed it myself, and I have frames selected. In fact, I also have frames selected for the default duration of still images. Now, you could change this to seconds. Why would Adobe do this? Here's why. Because I shoot a lot of my projects at 30p, and for me, this represents half a second. But what if I was shooting at 24? This would not represent half a second, would it? It would still be 15 frames. But I believe by default in our minds, we're thinking, okay, hey, 15 frames, half a second. No, not necessarily. It really depends on the frame rate you're shooting your projects in. So Adobe gave us the option to go with seconds, which makes a lot of sense. So at any frame rate, you can type in the duration of any one of these, and it will be applicable to the frame rate that you shot. So I'm going to go back and leave it on frames. I'm just a little more comfortable with that. I set mine to 15, and because I shoot everything at 30 frames, sometimes 60, 150 frames if I shot it at 30p would represent 5 seconds, so I'm comfortable with that. For any still image that I bring into Premiere will default to 5 seconds long. Again, you can change these at any time you want. You can come right back in here and make changes. Just keep in mind that it will affect that project you're working in, and it'll affect future projects when you make changes. Okay, so let's move on down. These are all great. Snap playhead at timeline when Snap is enabled. I mean, these are all good the way they are. You don't really need to look at anything other than I've been asked about this, default scale to frame size. That basically means if this is checked, when you bring a larger resolution file, such as a photo or 4K video into a 2K timeline, like an HD timeline, then Premiere will automatically scale it to fit. Whether it's too big or too small, Premiere will scale it down or up to fit the resolution as best as it can. That might sound good at the beginning. However, the challenge is it's a permanent scale. And you lose a lot of that additional information that might have been there. Let's say, for instance, if you shot some high resolution photos on a current DSLR and the resolution is somewhere around, who knows, 6,000 something by 4,000 something, and you drop it into a 1920 by 1080 timeline, if that's unchecked, in a later lesson, I show you how to select an option called Set to Frame Size, which does scale it down, but allows you to rescale up and down and still maintain all of the original information. It's probably a better way to go. I show you that in a different lesson, and it pertains to your sequence options. So let's leave this unchecked. All right, other than that, everything down here is great. You want to make sure these are all for selected, render audio when rendering video, so on and so forth. Make sure those are checked. Okay, let's move on to appearance. I like this one because with this slider here, you can darken your workspace or brighten your workspace. A lot of editors like to darken it, so it really makes the video punch right off the screen. It looks fantastic. For my training, though, I'm going to leave this on the bright side because it'll be harder to see if I don't have that on the brighter side for all these lessons. So I'm glad that's there. It's a great little item if you want to make changes to how your workspace is either lighter or darker. Okay, audio, everything here is just about right, except for two things real quick. Mute input during timeline recording. Make sure that's checked. When you do the voiceover punch-in to your sequence, that's a different feature that I show you in a different lesson, you won't get audio feedback. Premiere avoids that when this is checked. It's really cool, and I do keep that checked when I show you the lesson. I come in here and I change it and I check it, because by default I don't believe it's checked. These items here, default audio tracks, I would suggest mono for all of these. Having it selected on stereo for all of these is not a deal breaker. But when stereo is selected, I believe stereo is the default selection on older versions of Premiere Pro CC. The challenge with that is when you bring video or audio down into your sequence, if it was originally recorded in a stereo track, the left and right channels are harder to get to independently. When you have these selected to mono, it's much easier to get to each channel individually, discreetly. You can get to the left and the right channel, and they actually show up on separate layers here in your sequence as well. So having mono selected for these items is the way to go. Okay, let's move on to audio hardware. Everything here is fantastic. You can leave it the way it is. Auto save, you may want to change this to 10, maybe even 5 minutes for the auto save to kick in. Now don't forget, you can always do a manual save too at any point. But if you forget, like most of us do, whatever increment this is set to, I'm going to say 10 max for a beginner editor, maybe even 5 minutes. This is a lifesaver. It's saved me a few times over the years, and you can leave maximum project versions at 20. Okay, and save backup project to Creative Cloud. You definitely want that checked. Of course, that's only going to work if your computer is on or connected to the internet. Okay, all right, capture. This pertains to some of you, not a whole lot of you, but some of you that are doing legacy capturing from a Betacam deck or digital Betacam or Hi8 or something like that. You want to make sure those are all checked. Okay, so that way you get dropped frames, or you won't get drop frames. You'll get a report on drop frames. Sometimes you'll get drop frames if your hard drive isn't fast enough. But you do want this information when you are using legacy connections to older decks. And by the way, if you do have Betacam or digital Betacam, something like that, you have to have additional hardware for that, right? Blackmagic makes it, AJA makes it. It's like a bridge, and it communicates to those decks, and audio and video come through that hardware into your edit system. So, and actually, as a matter of fact, that'll come up here in the device control, which I'll talk about in just a second. Okay, control surface. This is actually pretty handy if you happen to have some kind of a device like, for instance, Mackie makes an audio mixer, and it connects to your system via the USB, and it would show up on this list. You can add it, and you can use it in Premiere. It's very cool. And of course, the differences are, there are many differences out there with all the different hardware. I can't really talk specifically about one certain item, but that was just an example, that Mackie mixer that you can connect to your computer system via USB, and you can control the volume of anything on your sequence or up in the source window. It's very cool. Okay, device control. I mentioned that a moment ago. If you are doing legacy capturing, even from DV or HDV, you'll see that option show up here. If you happen to have a Blackmagic or an AJA device, and you want to communicate to a digital Betacam deck or Betacam or Hi8, back then they had different protocols for communication, you would have the option here to select that hardware. Pretty cool. Okay, label colors and label defaults. Don't need to really talk too much about this. You can change the color and the name of the color if you'd like. And of course, the label defaults, you can change the color here for the bin or the sequence items, video and audio, so on and so forth. So you can customize the colors and even change the names if you'd like, which is not too bad. Media, okay, this is a good one here. This by default is generally not checked depending on the version of Premiere that you have. But basically, if you do decide to have it checked, what this is you're asking Premiere to save the media cache files next to the original when possible. That basically means that if you select your project drive, which is what I suggest, you select your project drive. Now remember, that should be a separate drive from your system drive, whether it's external or internal. You would want to select that drive. And that will definitely, or at least incrementally, increase the performance of your edit system. So it's definitely not a bad way to go. Okay, this down here, intermediate media time base. This really depends on the frame rate that you believe you're going to be shooting most of your projects in. Some of you are shooting 24, some of you are shooting 60, or some of you are shooting 30. And of course, you can always come back and change this here if you'd like. I think today's editors are shooting and editing in so many different frame rates. This probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense to select it here. And of course, whenever you create your sequence, you can change the frame rate then as well. So this is more or less just a kind of a home base, if you want to call it that, for frame rate for your intermediate media time base. So I'm going to go with 30 because that's generally most of the projects that I shoot are 30p or sometimes 60p. Okay, time code. This is interesting because you have the option for start at 000. Why would you need that and why would you want that? Well, a lot of current DSLRs and a lot of older DSLR cameras did not and do not generate time code. And if that's the case, you can select start at 0000 for the time code. And I've got to tell you, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference whether you use media source or start at 0000. It helps a little bit when you're using the older legacy cameras. I've been using some of those older DSLR cameras and I've never had a problem. So, but my current cameras do generate time code, so I definitely want to use this, use media source, which makes a little more sense to me. Okay, that's good the way it is. It starts 0. All these other items are great. You can leave them the way they are. Memory is a big one. This basically means that out of the 12 gigs of RAM that I have installed in my computer, I can allocate more RAM to these running applications. So for instance, if I want to change that to, let's say, I'll go with 5. So that means RAM reserved for other applications is 5 out of the 12, which means 7 of the 12 will be allocated to Premiere and Photoshop. If I had encoder running, these would be dividing this gig or the 7 gigs of RAM. And so I can change that to 3 if I want. Now 9 gigs will be allocated to these 2 apps. Not a bad way to go because the more RAM you have, the more performance you're going to get out of these apps because they both need and both want a lot of RAM. And I know that I've recommended 16 gigs of RAM in your edit system, and I believe that's probably the minimum you want as a professional editor. This is an older edit system I'm working on, by the way, but I just haven't upgraded it yet to 16 gigs. In fact, when I do that, I'll probably go beyond that on this computer. And I haven't had too much of a problem with 12 gigs on this edit system. But anyway, if I close Photoshop or I close anything else other than Premiere, all 9 gigs would be allocated to Premiere. So if that makes sense to you, the more RAM you have, incrementally, the more performance you're going to get out of any of these Adobe applications that need RAM. Okay? Okay, optimize rendering for performance, leave that there. Playback, pre-roll, post-roll, I've changed these to 2. When I'm using the trim edit window, basically what Premiere will do is rewind 2 seconds before the edit point and begin to play, and it will play 2 seconds beyond the edit point. So I kind of like that. I'll leave that there. This in here is interesting. Now, I don't have anything showing right now, but when I connect my external 42-inch flat screen high definition monitor, it'll show up here. And why it does that is because Premiere is saying, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Editor, you can check a little box that will show up next to that display. And when you do that, Premiere will send out full screen, whatever is showing in your program monitor, it'll send it out to your external monitor. And we call that a client monitor. And basically, when your client is next to you or near you or behind you while you're editing, they don't have to look at the smaller program window. They can simply look out onto their, what we call client monitor. And of course, as long as it's connected to your computer system in whatever fashion it needs to be connected in, as long as you have it checked, Premiere will send it out to that monitor. It's very handy, and I've got to tell you, customers and clients really, really like that. So I highly suggest you do that. And you'll see it when you connect it properly to your edit system. It'll show up here, and you'll want to make sure that it's activated by clicking on the box. Very, very handy, very good way to go. Okay, sync settings. These are all, I believe, selected by default. And basically what this is it will sync your settings to your cloud account. And this, you can see here, this was the last time I synced my settings or the last time I changed that would give me a date to save those. But basically your settings, your layouts, and your shortcuts will all be saved. I highly recommend that all 3 of these are checked, and you want Ask My Performance, or I'm sorry, you want Ask My Preference when doing that, okay? And you don't want to check this automatically clear settings on application quit. The other 2 items are very basic. I don't need to go over those. Those are all very self-explanatory, but I did cover all the most important items in the preferences for beginner editors and intermediate editors as well. So we've covered them. You can then select OK. They'll then be applied. and you're good to go. So that's about it for this lesson. You are now ready for the next lesson.